Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic recording for the lesson on African kingdoms. And in this particular lesson, we're going to be looking at Southern and Eastern African kingdoms in this time in early African history. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to the part of today's lesson, and then we'll move forward from there. Please remember that you have to answer the key concept questions that appear on the Google Doc. Try to include as much detail as possible. But here are some of the kingdoms that we're going to be talking about in today's lesson. The Kingdom of Kush, Axum, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Some of these kingdoms were covered essentially in Crash Course for Mansa Musa and North and West African kingdoms, but often the kingdoms that are not given as much focus are the societies in East Africa and in Southern Africa. So we're going to be looking at them today in more in-depth detail. So there's little or no evidence of ironworking in Eastern and Southern Africa before the arrival of the Bantu, suggesting that new technology was spread by migrants. In Eastern Africa, a variety of states and small societies took root. Islam strongly influenced many of them. Some became extremely wealthy and as a result of trade. Migration of the Bantus. South of Axum, along the shores of the Indian Ocean and inland from the mountains of Ethiopia through the Lake District of Central Africa, lived a mixture of peoples. Some lived by hunting and food gathering, whereas others raised livestock. Beginning in the first millennium BC, new peoples began to migrate into Eastern Africa from the west. Farming peoples who spoke dialects of the Bantu family of languages began to move from the region of the Niger River into East Africa and the Congo River basin. They moved slowly, not as invading hordes, but as small communities. Recent archaeological work has provided us with a better idea of the nature of Bantu society. The communities that arose as a result of these population movements were based on subsistence farming, growing just enough crops for personal use, not for sale. So the primary crops were grains, millet, and sorghum, along with yams, melons, beans, and the land was farmed with both iron and stone tools. Within the families in the villages, men and women performed different tasks, and women tilled the fields and cared for the children, and men tended the herds or engaged in such tasks as hunting and trade. Most trade was local and involved necessities such as salt and commodities such as animal products, copper, and iron ore. On the next page here, the Indian Ocean and trade ports. On the eastern fringe of the continent, the Bantu-speaking peoples gradually began to take part in regional trade that moved the sea up and down the East African coast. Within the growth of the regional trade following the rise of Islam during the 7th and 8th centuries AD, the eastern coast of Africa became an important part of trading network along the Indian Ocean. Beginning in the 8th century, Muslims from the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf began to settle at ports along the coast. The result was formation of a string of trading ports that included Mogadishu, or Mombasa, and Kilwa in the south. Merchants in these cities grew very wealthy. One of the most magnificent cities in the day was Kilwa. In the 14th century, two monumental buildings were constructed in Kilwa of coral cut from the cliffs along the shore. One was the Great Mosque of Kilwa, and even grander was the Hasuni Kuba Palace, an enormous cliff-top building of more than 100 rooms. Members of Kilwa's wealthy elite built their houses near the palace and Great Mosque. With imported Chinese porcelain and indoor plumbing, these homes provided a luxurious lifestyle. The Arab traveler Ibn Battuta called Kilwa, which he visited in 1331, quote, one of the most beautiful towns in the world, end quote. Kilwa's splendor did not last long, However, Kilwa began to decline, and the Portuguese finished the job in 1505 by sacking the city and destroying its major buildings. As time passed, a mixed African-Arabian culture, eventually known as Swahili, began to emerge throughout the coastal area. Intermarriage was common among the ruling groups, and gradually the Muslim religion and Arabic architectural styles became part of society, still largely African. The term Swahili, from Sahel meaning coast in Arabic and thus peoples of the coast, was also applied to the major language used in the area. Swahili used was a mixed language that combined Bantu with a number of Arabic words and phrases. Today, it is the national language of Kenya and Tanzania. Now let's focus on states and stateless societies in South Africa. In the southern half of the African continent, states formed more slowly than in the north. Until the 11th century AD, most peoples in this region lived in what are sometimes called stateless societies. A stateless society is a group of independent villages organized by clans and led by a local ruler or clan head. In the grassland region south of the Zambezi River, a mixed economy of farming, cattle herding, and trading had developed over a period of many centuries. Villages in this area were usually built inside walls to protect the domestic animals from wild animals at night. So beginning in the 11th century, in some parts of southern Africa, these independent villages gradually began to consolidate. Out of these groupings came the first states. From about 1300 to about 1450, Zimbabwe was the wealthiest and most powerful state in the region. It prospered from the gold trade and with Swahili trading communities on the eastern coast of the continent. Indeed, Zimbabwe's gold ended up in the court of Kublai Khan, Emperor of China, but the ruins of Zimbabwe's capital, known as Great Zimbabwe, illustrate the kingdom's power and influence. The town sits on a hill overlooking the Zambezi River and is surrounded by stone walls. 10,000 residents would have been able to live in the area enclosed by the walls, and artifacts found at the site include household implements, ornaments made of gold and copper, and porcelain imported from China. The Great Enclosure, whose exact purpose is not known, dominated the site. It was an oval space surrounded by a wall 800 feet long, 17 feet thick, and 32 feet high. And not only was it near the Great Enclosure were smaller walled enclosures that combined around houses built of a mud-like cement on stone foundations, but in the valley below was a royal palace, surrounded by a high stone wall. The massive walls of Great Zimbabwe are unusual, and the local people stacked granite blocks together without mortar to build the walls. By the middle of the 15th century, however, the city was abandoned, possibly because of damage to the land through overgrazing and natural disasters such as droughts and crop failures. So as you can see, there are some substantial differences between South and Eastern kingdoms of Africa and their counterparts in North and Western part of the continent. But keep in mind that many of those reasons might be due in part to the fact that the culture, the histories, and the, I guess you could say, migration of people coming in contact with other people did differ. Think about the role that religion plays too in the development of some of the early African trading empires that we just talked about. Thank you very much for tuning in, and good luck with the completion of the rest of your lesson.